Okay, so I am back. Now, I have actually done quite a bit since the last update there. Unfortunately, I had kids about and they're far too loud to be recording around, unfortunately. However, what I can do is go through some of the things I've done already and then possibly work on some of the next sections together. So, as a quick update, so what I've done so far, it's a little bit bigger. So we can now pick up the items. And they will, a few more, they will now actually show up in the UI. So this is the new version of the UI. So for the most part, it should look exactly the same as the old one, but it should function just a little bit better. So we have the top buttons that'll cycle through the different categories, and it'll update the preview menu here. And click on them, and it updates the item as well. Now there are some special quirks. So for the ammo, even though it's not stackable, it's still grouped under a single option, and then when you click on it, it'll give you a little bit of a breakdown of how many rounds there's in each clip essentially. So it just helps reduce the number of the amount of information being shown on the screen. So a few more things I do need to do. So there was a section on the right hand side here which showed the weapon stats, so we do need to update and add that there. And there was also a production cost bar just to the left of where the description is. But I do feel that that itself should probably move to this right hand side as well, and only have it show up for items that are actually craftable, because I believe previously it was always visible. So that way it just helps reduce, again, the amount of information on screen, and kind of removing it when it's not necessary. Things like all these resources, these themselves aren't necessarily craftable, certainly not at this stage anyway. That could of course change in the future. So it kind of just helps reduce the amount of clutter we have. So let me go ahead and actually open up the widget. So actually what I'll do first, I'll actually open up the original, so you can kind of see what we're working with. And then I'll show you the newer version where I've made some of the sort of changes. So currently, in terms of the old inventory, a lot of it was kind of in the main widget, so obviously it's quite cluttered and chaotic. And this of course then causes some issues with whenever you want to make any small tweaks or updates, it can be quite disorientating knowing where it is you need to go and other things. Adding to that as well, there is actually an issue with the way that this is currently laid out. So much so that if we actually change the screen size, you can see here, there are certain sections that don't actually scale accordingly. So you can end up with sections that end up getting cut off the screen. So if somebody has like a slightly smaller screen width, for example, so what is it, 1280? I could probably just select one from here. Yeah, so if we was go for just 720, yeah, so we're going to go custom, so that's what, 1280 by 720. You'll notice that a lot of it gets cut off, and that's obviously not something we want to happen. We kind of want the UI to be a little bit more responsive in the sense that it updates accordingly. And part of the issue that we have here is it's actually in a canvas panel. So that kind of causes some of these issues that we're having here. So generally when we are building UI, we do want to try and avoid using canvas panels where possible. We can normally do everything using horizontal and vertical boxes in combination with overlay boxes, which you should see shortly. So I'm just going to go ahead and get that to fill the screen again. So the thing with this fill screen, it is using a DPI scale, so it's actually scaling it down, so that's why it does look okay in this particular scenario. But again, if it wasn't exactly like these perfect ratios, then it could end up looking a little bit weird. So if we kind of have a quick look at how this is all set up, again, there's quite a lot of stuff sort of dotted around. There is some functions in here that probably shouldn't be in here that are more specific to the actual inventory system itself. But again, we can go over some of that stuff in a second. Now, one thing I did notice in here is the use of these bindings under the content section. So it happens quite frequently. So that probably explains why quite a lot of these sort of functions. So they're not overly complicated. However, the issue is that generally you want to try and avoid using these types of bindings in the UI. And the reason why is because these actually, they essentially update on tick, which can be quite bad for performance. You can end up with really bad performance metrics for your UI if you have quite a lot of stuff on tick. There is actually a setting under the project settings that allows you to disable it outright. That's how bad Epic thinks it is. I would imagine it's only there mainly for legacy purposes, but yeah. So if you are starting a new project and it's something you do want to worry about, just disable it in the project settings, and then no one will be able to use it. So generally, with a lot of these values, they don't need to be updating on tick. You can just update it on an event, so it only updates when it needs to. So that sort of thing itself tends to be a little bit more desirable when doing things like this. Another few things to note in terms of how these buttons are laid out. So if I actually go to jump to one of these, we'll actually sort of see the on-click events. So these are all the on-click events for the various buttons on the top. And if we actually look at the logic that follows it, for the most part, it's pretty much identical. The only difference is the widgets that we're using and the filter option that we apply to the inventory. Beyond that, most of it's pretty much the same. So there's obviously quite a lot of repetition here, so it becomes very easy to accidentally make a mistake, which then kind of causes confusion when it happens, because then you sort of think if it was an issue with one button, you'd kind of expect it to happen with all of them. But because of the way the buttons are set up, that's not necessarily the case. So I will sort of show you how it is I set up the buttons on the newer version in a second. But again, in terms of all the other buttons, you have like all the hover states and stuff as well. So obviously this is quite chaotic and bloaty. Bloaty is probably a better word. And personally, I hate having to repeat myself a lot. So in this case, it's all very similar stuff. So what I'm going to actually do now is actually close out of the older version and open up the newer version. And we kind of see some of the changes that I've made in terms of building the UI. So the first thing you'll probably notice is this is actually the whole widget at this particular point. So I've actually gone ahead and separated certain sections into their own dedicated widgets. Now that can be quite useful because it means that some of these sections could be reused in other widgets whilst maintaining that functionality. So that can be quite nice to help us not have to keep repeating ourselves when we're essentially wanting to do the same behaviour somewhere else. So if we actually go ahead and look at these category buttons at the top, you'll notice there's just a horizontal box. Now this is actually a smart horizontal box that's inside of Project Sunrise that I set up. And this is just a horizontal box that adds some padding to all the children automatically, so I can just automatically update that for all of them without having to select them individually. Now the reason I use this particular one for these bars is because we do actually add them dynamically. So if I come into here, into the graph, and we go to the pre-constructs, this allows us to create them dynamically. And there's one main function here which is called the create cat bar. So the first thing we actually do is we get all the children of the category bar and we cast to the main menu button. Now this menu button is another widget, so I'll go through that in a second as well. And this particular button does have an event dispatcher on it. It's called on button pressed. That'll probably make a little bit more sense in a minute. And all I do is just unbind all events from that on button press. And the reason why is because we actually plan to clear it. So we essentially just clear all the buttons whenever we first create this widget, just in case there's any that are lingering on there for any reason. And then it's this section here where we actually recreate them. So I have this So I have this array here, so it is a text array, and this contains all the names of the category buttons, so all weapons, ammunition, consumables, and resources. And if I want to add another one, I can just pop it here. Example. Like so, and if I was to compile and save, you'll see it adds it automatically at the end there. Now, for some of you, you're probably wondering, well, if you're adding them dynamically, how can you control what each button does? That's a very good question. Now, as I mentioned up here, it has an event dispatcher on it called onButtonPressed. So when we actually create the button, we add it to a local variable here. The only reason we do that is just for later on, because of the smart horizontal box, it allows me to add multiple widgets at once. So that way you can update them all and apply all the padding all at the same time, so it's a bit more performant. So generally you might not necessarily need this section, but what we do is we actually bind to that function, so the event dispatcher on the widget, and that's the on button pressed. And it's here we actually control what happens. So when any of the buttons is clicked, it calls the event dispatcher, so the on button pressed, which we then say, hey, when this event dispatcher is called, run this function. So in this case it's called on button pressed, and that's inside this particular widget. So if we actually open the on button pressed, we get this. So we have a sequence. This just allows us to do two things, make things a little bit tidier. Now you'll notice the function actually has an index, and when we create the buttons, we assign an index to it, and this index gets passed through to the on button pressed here, which allows us to control what happens. So because I know what order the buttons are going to be pressed in, I can then just call this filter items function, which I have in a different widget, and that kind of does its own thing. And then lastly we have this clear button selection, and all that does is it gets all the children, loops through and just sets them all to not selected. And what that does, it just means that once we've clicked the button, it will clear the selection, so when we then add a new selection, we don't end up with two happening at once. So all in all, that's pretty much how the top buttons are set up. Let me just remove the example one there. Yep. Now if I actually go ahead and open up the button itself, this is the rough layout of that, so you kind of see how that's set up. So we have the button in the background, we then have an overlay inside that. The button itself though is set to fully transparent, so we don't actually see it. We then have an overlay followed by a background. So this is just an image. So that's what we use to control the highlight. We then have a horizontal panel, horizontal box with, again, two images at the side. That's just to add these little outline bars and the text in the middle. So in terms of the functionality, we do have a function called update sidebar color, and that just updates the color on the side. And the reason we have that is because in the main one we have this extra production button which we wanted as the green outline. So going back to the menu button again, so as you can see there isn't anything overly fancy in here. If we then come to the main event graph, this is the bulk of the logic. There's a little extra here which is what we used for setting the selection state. So this just updates the various brushes and the opacity on things, depending on whether or not it should be selected or not. But other than that, everything else is pretty much set up here. So the pre-construct, that just allows for the initial setup. So we have the button text, which is instance editable and exposed on spawn, so that's what allows us to specify here. Adding to that, we then have the hovered states. So again, with all these buttons, they should all have the same hovered state, but there is options here where we can kind of change what some of those are. So when we hover, we just get whether or not it's selected or not. So if it's not selected, then it'll update, and then with the hovered, we have a sound as well. Now the magical bit here is this section here, so the on button press. So again, when the button is released, it calls this event dispatcher, passes through its button index, and again as a reminder, that's what we assign here when we first create the widget. So you can kind of think of it, everything gets called in order. So once it calls this event dispatcher, everything in here on the on button pressed gets executed first. So, and if you see in here we have that clear button selection, that's where we clear all the selections. And it's then, once all that's run, then we update the selected on this button. So that's how, when we select one up here, it only has one selected. So there's nothing overly complicated in terms of keeping track of which one was currently selected or anything like that. We just clear all the selections and then select the one we want afterwards. So it's just all about the order in this particular example. But yeah, so in terms of those menu buttons, that's it really. There's not a lot there. Obviously, there's a little bit more in terms of how we set up the filter items, but I'll circle back round to that shortly. So coming back to here, we then have a widget switcher. And the whole idea of the widget switcher is that when we click on the production button, it would allow us to switch to a completely different section on here, just like the previous version. Now, currently we have the main infantry widget, so I'm just going to go ahead and open that up. And that's what this one looks like. So again, there's nothing much in here at the moment. Well, there is a lot in here actually, but it doesn't look like it. And the reason why is because again, we've kind of condensed some of the things into their own individual widgets. So the first one here is the infantry container. Now, the infantry container is just a way of being able to display the items in an infantry in a specific section, and generally the idea is that it will always do it in the same sort of manner. So the infantry container can be then used in other widgets. So if you wanted to do something like a container type of widget where you have two infantries side by side, we can use the same widget essentially twice in that widget, and all we do is just pass a different infantry to it, and it'll just pull the information it needs from the relevant infantry. So that's kind of why that's been set up. And then additionally we have this one here, which is the actual item data display. So this is what displays the information for the selected item that we have. So again, these are the two separate widgets. Again, chances are we probably won't use the item data display anywhere else, but you never know. There might be somewhere else that something like this could be quite useful. So it is kind of an option. What I'm going to do next is actually just show some of the functions we actually have in this one. So in terms of the constructs, that's when the widget is first created. What we do is we get the owning player pawn, and then from there we actually get the infantry system component from it. Now this itself should probably have an isValid on there, and we could probably put a print string at some point just to say that the owning pawn doesn't have an infantry, just to help with debug. And the reason we do this is because the infantry system is on the player pawn, so the player character in this example. And because it should always be on there, then we kind of have an access point where we can quite easily get that information. So again, that's just for this particular infantry, because this is designed for the player viewing their infantry. Once it's done that, it then calls a function on the infantry container. So that is this specific widget here. And what we do is we call update infantry, and we're actually passing the target infantry. So that's saying, hey, update the infantry using this infantry component. Now I'll look into that in a second. Last thing in here is filter items. Now this is kind of just more of a proxy function, just to call set filter class on that container. So that's the same container. Now if we go back to the infantry menu, so that's this function here. So we're calling that on this main widget, which again calls set filter class on the container itself. Now if we wanted to in here, we could have gotten the infantry container, and just call that set filter function manually. But for me, I think it's just a little bit cleaner to do it this way. Plus that way, if we wanted to, yeah, I think it's just cleaner. Obviously, either method will work, and it's completely up to you which one you want to do. The next thing we sort of have here is the on item selection changed. Now, the on item selection changed is actually an event dispatcher that I've set up on the infantry container. So when we're actually selecting a button, that event dispatcher gets called and it kind of relays it back to this main outer widget. And the reason we do that is because then it allows us to get the data from it, from the new selection, and update the display. So as a reminder, the item display here, and it does have a preview window, and then some data that needs updating as well. So that kind of just allows us to do that. So we're able to pass in the item-based object that we want to display into here, and that'll update its thing. Now there is an additional aspect here, which is an item grouping object, and that's used mainly for this particular list here. So if I was to actually pick these up, because there are some of the items we want to group together even though they're not stackable, that's where the item grouping object comes in. So it essentially allows us to create an item grouping object which is used for this main button here, and then inside of that we actually store the items itself that we wanted to represent, which we can then use to pull the additional data here as child, and that just uses the tree tree view. There we go. The tree view here. So I'm using specifically the common tree view from the common UI, but that's kind of what that does. But yeah, so this particular function here, that's just where we are calling that update item display. Now, before we sort of delve into the item display section, let's go ahead and just quickly look into the infantry container itself. So, in terms of the components within here, there is just that common tree view. There isn't anything else in here. So, using the various view type components, so I believe there's the list view as well. So these ones here. In a lot of cases, you do need to have an entry widget class specified, and that controls what widget gets placed, essentially. So I will show that widget in a second. But if we actually then go into here, the main graph, so we have the update function. So if I go back into here, so that's this function here, the update. This is, if you remember, this is where we pass in the infantry system. We have a section up at the top here. This just clears the list view that we have. So the infantry list, that just clears any items we have in there to begin with. And then once we've done that, we come down here and we can start the process of updating it. So the first thing we do is we store a reference to the infantry that we're using to get the information from. We then get the items from it. Again, this is directly from the infantry system. This just passes it through. And then we have this additional function here, which is build item list. So ultimately, it's building this function, this array here, which is items to display. And the reason we have a dedicated function for that is because we might want to filter all the items. Now, if I come into this one, you'll see a section up here. And this is where we start checking the filter class. So if we have a valid filter class here, that means one of these is actually selected. Now, if we wanted to, we could technically just filter just for a specific type, like only the pistol of the white variant. That itself not particularly useful though. But what we can actually do is filter by the parent classes. Now the parent classes themselves are abstract, so it doesn't actually let me select them directly here. But if I was to get the find item of class, for example, it does let us select it on these ones, so like item consumable, or we have the item weapon and item resources, so we can actually just filter, just find all the items of that specific class in this example, and that's exactly what we do here. Now if you remember, I did show how to set up the find items of class function previously. And this particular function is just what's used to get all the item objects of a given class essentially. Now I did make one additional change here, and that's just that if the inputted item class is the item base, I could probably do it if it's not valid as well. Although technically it up here is not valid, but if it's item base, then it just returns all the keys, so all the item objects, and that's just kind of like a shortcut where we don't then have to go through the loop essentially. If we want all the items, then we just now once we've done that, we've got the items that we want to sort, and the reason we sort them is just so they're sorted alphabetically. So otherwise it can be quite difficult to update. So that's kind of what this section here does. So it takes the items to sort, so that's this, where we set this up here, and we essentially loop through them based on this here. So now this particular section here, there is a little bit more involved than I'd like it to be, but unfortunately sorting can be quite complex. So in this particular example, on the main infantry system itself, I actually created a new array called item names. Now this particular array is updated automatically whenever an item is removed or added to the infantry. So if I was to come to the item add function, no, it's in the increment item, we have this section here which is add item name. So we essentially get the name of the item that we've added, and then we call this function. So the first thing it does just checks, is the name already in there? If it isn't, then we add it, and then we sort the array. So generally doing it sort of this way means that we have a sorted array of all the names ready, because this kind of just saves us then in the UI here having to loop through all the items, get the names, then sort them, and then do all this. So it's kind of just offloading this to a different portion, if that makes sense. So we do it part of the adding process. Additionally, we then have something a little bit similar for the remove items. This one is a little bit more difficult. Well, I don't want to say difficult, a little bit more involved. So for this one, we first check, is the item stackable? The reason we check that is because if it is stackable, if we've made it to this particular point, then there isn't any more of it in the infantry, so we can just remove the name outright. We don't need to worry about it. If it isn't stackable, we check whether or not we still have any of the items of that type in the infantry. If we don't, then that's when we remove the name. And again, in terms of the remove name, we don't do the sorting on this particular point because the names themselves should already be sorted. So removing one shouldn't affect the order, the sorting. It's only normally when we add one, because it'll get added at the end, and that probably needs to get added somewhere else. So that's kind of how that works. And again, that's just a way to be able to get a list of all the items, or the names of the items in the infantry in alphabetical order. So with that in mind, we then have that function which allows us to get the names, and we just loop through them. So it's going to start with, again, the first one in the list, so we then check the name of the items to sort, and we check to see if the name matches our source, our target, and if it does, then we add it to the sorted list. And by the time it's looped through all of them and re-added them to the sorted items, they should all be in alphabetical order. And the reason we do that is because when we add items to the tree view, they will be in the order they get added. So the order is quite important. At this particular point, we loop through all the items and we essentially create that item grouping object I mentioned earlier. So if I actually open up the item grouping object, you'll see that there's the quantity and items. So this is a list of all the items that should be in the group. And then we have some helper functions here just to add some of the items to it. So the quantity itself is updated automatically when we add an amount. Add an item object to it. But there are some sort of a more forceful way of setting the quantity if we need to. So again, nothing fancy. This is just a custom new object, purely using it as a means of storing data. Yeah, so the first thing we do with the item here is we check whether or not it's stackable. So if it's stackable, we would assume that there's only ever going to be one item object of that given class in the inventory. The reason why is because it would then just have its quantity amount incremented. So as a reminder, it is stored as a map. Now, if that's the case, we do still create an item grouping and we add an item to it, so the loop item, but we actually forcefully set the quantity in there as well. So we actually get the quantity from here and we pass it through. And once we've done that, we then add the item grouping to the items to display array. Now, if we come back down to whether or not it's stackable, if it's not stackable, we then check whether or not it should be grouped. So if the answer is false, we just go ahead and create it, add the item to the group, and then we just add the item grouping object to the items to display. Now, if we should group, such as the ammo, for example, that's where it gets a little bit more complex. So we actually have an array, another map here, where we actually keep track of the specific grouping objects, where we're actually wanting to group them. So generally this would be item grouping objects that would have more than one item in them, or could potentially have more than one item in them. So we first check the class of the loop item and we see whether or not it's in that list. If it is, then we can just go ahead straight away and just add the loop item to it. We don't need to worry about doing anything else at that particular stage. If however we don't find it, so that particular class is not in this map, what we have to do is actually create a new item grouping object. So that's similar to what we do here. We add it to the items display, but then we actually need to then add it to that child items map, where we keep track of it using the class. So again, we use the class of the loop item here, and then lastly we just add the loop item to that item grouping. So that's kind of what we do there in terms of building the item list. So once we've finished in this function, we come back out to here. Is at this particular point we actually take that tree view and we actually set the list items on it. So this is the objects that we want to view. Now, these objects themselves, they don't have to be specifically the list view objects. They can actually be any type of object, but I'll kind of go over that in a second. But generally the items to display would always, in this particular example, would always be one of those grouping objects at this particular stage. Lastly, what we then do is we check whether or not the items to display is empty or not. So if we don't actually have anything in the inventory, what we do is we set what we call the onItemSelected changed, and we just pass in a null object, which allows this here, so this is in the main inventory again, to update and essentially pass a blank null ref through to here, which is set up to then clear everything if it is null. So that's kind of what we do there. If it's not empty, then we update the inventory list to then select the first index, so the first item in that list. So that's why, if we quickly play again, if I pick a few items up, if I open up the inventory, it'll always select the first one. And the reason why is because of this particular node there. Okay, so for the most part, that's kind of the inventory container completed. However, there is one additional thing that is set up. So on the tree view, if we scroll all the way to the bottom, there is this option here, which is on get item children. Now, this is essentially an event that you have to override on here. So if I open up that, so it's just a function called show child items, and this is where we get the children that we need to be displaying. So if I come ahead and play again, and we pick up some ammo. So when I click on the ammo, it's that clicking action that then triggers this to happen. Now, if we don't return anything, so it's empty, which would happen if we click like medkit or the Spectre. If we click these ones, it just returns a blank array, so nothing happens. We don't get any expansion. But with the ammo, we do get the expansion because we actually return the items that are listed inside the item group. So that's how we kind of get the children to show up. Now, there is some additional logic we have here as well to kind of handle when there is only one item in the list. Because if we've created something like, so let's say we've got like non-stackable items, there will still be an item listed in here. So it's going to be one, but we don't actually necessarily want to show any additional sort of drop down for it. So that's kind of where we check. So if it's less than one, so it comes out as false, we check whether or not it should be grouping that particular type of object. And if we don't, then we just, again, return that null array, so that empty array. Otherwise, we just return the whole items array from the item grouping object. So when we actually do this, it will automatically create a new entry into the tree view, similar to how we would when we call the set item list. It kind of just inserts them accordingly. So it creates a new widget for it if it needs to, and then calls the relevant function on the widget. So that's kind of how the inventory container itself works. So what I'm going to do now is actually look at how the item slot entry works. So this is the widget that gets created every time we add a new item to the list, as it were. So whenever you are using those sort of tree views or list views, you can only select something in the list if the widget itself implements the user object list entry. So that's what I've got here, and that then adds some of these additional functions under the interface section that you then implement. Now the main one here is the onList item object set. So whenever we display a widget in the list, it will always pass the object that contains the data, so what we sort of pass in. And from there we can then do the relevant castings and essentially extract the data from those objects. So that's kind of what we're doing here. So the first thing we do is we check whether or not that item is actually one of the item grouping objects. The reason why is because if it is one of the list items in the tree, it will be passing the items array, which would be an item base instead. So we do need to distinguish what it is that we're supposed to be displaying the data for. So if it's an item grouping object, we can assume that it's one of the top level ones. So this should be displaying the core item data. So that's pretty much what we do here. So we do get the item from the item grouping object, but we'll just get the first entry. Generally, these should all be the same anyway, in terms of their core data. We update the item name, and then we get the quantity again from the item grouping object. In most cases, it will be the same as what's the number of entries in the item object, unless it is a stackable. So we do use the get quantity here, and we update the quantity there. Lastly, we have a widget switcher, which we just use to make sure we're on the correct page with the widget switcher. So again, if we just have a quick look in here, the structure of this particular widget. So vertical box, image on the top and bottom of the data the widget switcher, which I've called data switcher, and then inside there we have two child widgets. So we have the main one, which is a horizontal box. So that kind of contains the little selection thing here, and then the two text fields. In addition to that, we then actually have just an overlay called data container. And the idea of this sort of data container overlay is sort of acts as a way for us to create a new widget and pop it into there. So it kind of gets displayed. So that's kind of what we do down here essentially. So if we come through here and the object isn't an item grouping object and it is instead an item base, we know at this particular point we actually want to display the additional data because it's a grouped item essentially. So like the ammo. Now as a part of this we have an additional variable that was added to the item base called data widget. We check to see whether or not that's valid, and if it is, that's where we come through, we just clear what's already in that data container widget, because as a reminder, not that I mentioned it, the item entry widgets, they do get reused. So generally the widget itself, like the list and the tree view, it kind of keeps track of how many widgets it needs to kind of fill the space, and if it needs to create a new one it will do, but if it's got one that's in a pool, as it were, that's not currently being used, it will kind of recycle it. So we do need to make sure that we are updating things accordingly as if it's been used for something else already. So that's kind of why we clear it there. What we then do is we load the data widget, which is this function up here. So we just load it. Once it's loaded, we cast, we then create, we then get the current list object for this particular widget, so what it represents. We cast that to the item base, and then we call the update item data on this base widget. And then we do some alignment stuff as well. So this particular widget here, so if I open that up, it is a base widget, so there's not actually anything set up in here. But if I was to locate the one that's set up, so this is the one that was set up specifically for the ammo, so it is a child of this one. Populated it with what we need, so the rounds and then the ammo type, and then we have that update item data, and that's where we essentially get the data from the item object and display it. So yeah, and lastly, also we just update the widget index again. Now there's a few additional things we have down here. So these are the mouse over type events. So this just updates the background. So nothing overly fancy. So we just update the alpha based on whether or not it's hovered or not. Last thing we do here is update on selection changed. So this is when it's clicked, and we use that to update the colour of these little square bits here. So we set the middle bit to be visible if it's selected, and then we change the colour of the two widgets. That's these here. So that's pretty much how that is handled. And lastly, on entry release, so this is when that particular widget is no longer visible and gets added back to the pool. We then just clear the selector state, and this just prevents it, so if it was to be reused again, it's not going to be visible. Whether or not we need that, it's difficult to say, because there's not actually enough items yet to implement a scroll bar, which it does have. But this itself may need to get removed and popped up to here. I'm not entirely sure yet. But again, it's kind of one of those things that, particularly with UI, you tend to have to keep iterating and going back. But yeah, for the most part, that's how the inventory container itself works. So there's nothing else really going off there. But that particular widget is something that we can then reuse in other widgets if we need to. Now the next little bit that we have is the item data display. So that's this main bulk one here. So again, we can look at how that's sort of set up here. Now for this particular one, I do actually have other child widgets that are set up. And that's to kind of allow me to more easily display things in a very particular format. So to actually open some of these up, so the first one we have is this widget here called text display. And again, if I was to kind of show the hierarchy here, so nothing overly complicated. And then we have some functions that help update the display essentially based on the exposed variables that we have. So updating the dividers, so whether or not we want to show the top or bottom bars. So if we can actually show those. So again, we can decide whether or not we want to show the bars, whether or not we want to keep the padding on those, and then we can change whether or not we have the background and things like the background colour. In addition, we then have the text field here where we can just change the text and it'll update it for the whole section. So I don't want to linger on these too long, but I'm just going to quickly just kind of show it just so you can see what's happening. So again, nothing too complicated. Kind of just one of those things where there's just a few moving parts, so you kind of just have to just be aware of them really. So update text. We're setting the text justification and then the auto wrap of the text. So yeah, so that's pretty much all the functions in there. So that's just the text display. What I then do is actually have the data display base. So this one, it has a title which is using that text display, and then we have a name slot underneath. Now the name slot is something that when you create a child of, you can place something into it, which will make a little bit more sense in a second. But if we actually look at the logic in here, so the functions, again, there's just a few variables here that are instance editable. This is just so we can change them when we place it into the designer view. So on the so these things here, and then we have the update title function, which just gets the actual title widget, so that text display, and then essentially just passes the data through. So again, nothing overly complicated on that particular one either. Now the widget we've just shown is what we use here. So inside of here, we just set the title to preview, and then inside of it, we have that body name slot, and we just add another widget which handles the rendering of an item essentially. So that's kind of what that's for. So if we hide that, what I then do is actually one step further. So in terms of that base that we have there, I do actually have another one. So this one's a child of it. Now this is where in the body we actually have another text display. Now this one's a little bit different because we actually disable the bars. So the only bar that we see is the ones for the title. But in this particular case, we can set the body text and the title text as well. And again, nothing overly fancy here. We're just getting the body display, the body widget, and then just updating the display text on it. Now the reason why is because we don't need to do anything else for the title, because that's handled in the parent class. So because this is a child, it already has that. So with those, I kind of use them to help display some of this information here. So we have the main item name with their item description, and then we have an additional one here for the weight of the object. And again, we can kind of come in and we can change some of these options. Again, these are just options I've chosen to expose. It's kind of up to you how you want to handle these types of things. But it's definitely worth building some of reusable widgets like this, because it can help reduce how chaotic your widgets end up becoming. Because again, if we kind of go back to the source one, as it were, and we kind of look at some of these, So just for this entire section here, we have all of these sort of showing up, depending on which section it is. And sometimes trying to navigate through all these and whatnot can be quite difficult. And for the most part, these are pretty much the same and should look the same. So using a widget kind of helps facilitate that as well, a reusable widget. So it kind of helps get more consistent UI elements throughout your displays. Okay, so with that in mind, let's jump into what actually sort of meat, as it were. So the first thing we actually do, this is just in regards to the item renderer that we have. So we kind of just store a reference to an actual actor that handles it. If it's not valid, we create one, we store it, and we set the source, so the target, to the widget. That's it. And then when we destroy this particular widget, we destroy that actor as well, because it shouldn't be needed. So that's what we do there. In terms of the actual item display, so as a reminder, this is the function here. That's where we're updating it. So we pass that in whenever we select an item. We still reference to the base item. Well, sorry, the item object. And then we can start kind of extracting data from it. So if it's not valid, we can just come through and reset everything, which is what we do here. If it is valid, then we start pulling the data from it. So we update the title text for the description, so we get the display name. There's something similar with the body text for the description, but in this case we just get the description. Again, these functions were set up previously in the item base class. And then we have the weight one, again, just updating the body text. And then lastly, we just pass in the item object to the recording object. Now, in terms of this particular widget, this one isn't actually a widget. I myself haven't actually set this up myself, but I have made some tweaks for it to accommodate the new system. So I will quickly go through that. It is just a scene capture component that's used to essentially render the item. So you kind of think of it like a camera. It points at an object, and whatever it captures, it puts into a render target. So that's kind of what we're doing here. So we update the item we want to display. We clear the current mesh data, so that's just resetting some variables. Do some resetting again, and then we load the assets. So again, these are from the base class for the items, so the 3D display data. So the first thing we do is we actually load the material, and this is just so that it's ready and available for when we've loaded the mesh. And as I think about it, I need to do that. So easy to miss things. So if there isn't a valid display material, then we just go straight to the load mesh. We don't need to attempt to load anything. If there is a material, then we load that first, and then we call the load mesh function, which is this one here. And for this one, we then get the display mesh, and we load that asset, and then we refresh the mesh data. So generally, when we refresh the mesh data, these here should now be loaded. So when we attempt to resolve them, they should be valid. So that kind of allows us to update all of this in one fell swoop. And up here, because we do reset the mesh to empty when we first start, if there is a bit of a delay between the mesh loading, it should just appear blank. So you won't have that weird thing where you kind of have the old mesh still displaying whilst it's loading the new one. So that's why we do reset the mesh there. Okay. And that's kind of how that's sort of set up there. In terms of this specific widget here, which is what's used to actually display it, that's just an image inside a scale box, and the image is just using the material that is set up to use that particular render target material. So again, nothing overly complicated. There are quite a few tutorials on scene capture components and render targets. So this itself is not doing anything overly complicated or unheard of. So that's kind of an overview really of how this particular widget is set up. Now, just be aware that setting up UI stuff does take some time. I've probably spent quite a few hours setting all this stuff up. So it's probably a good thing I didn't record it all, if I'm going to be honest. Otherwise, it might have been, there would have been a lot of episodes. But yeah, so we are sort of getting there in terms of remaking that infantry system that we started with, and trying to do so in a more sort of structured and organised fashion. Now, the next thing I do kind of want to concentrate on is, if I open up the source one again, is actually this section here. So this is where all the weapon sort of stats are. So again, this is going to be its own unique widget that's only displayed when you're actually selecting a weapon. In addition, we do have the production costs that are here, and I kind of want to move those to this right hand side as well, and only show up if you're actually selected, if you've selected an item that is craftable. Because again, the idea is trying to reduce the amount of information on the screen at once. So trying to only show relevant information or details is obviously quite important. So what I was thinking is possibly going through and possibly setting up that one with you guys. Okay, so we'll start in a second.